We're back now with our political panel. Leslie Sanchez is a Republican strategist and CBS News political contributor. Ed O'Keefe is our political correspondent here at CBS. Amy Walter is the national editor of the Cook Political Report. And Anthony Salvanto is our director of elections and surveys, and he's here today with a batch of new poll numbers from the CBS News Battleground tracker. So, Anthony, what has changed this summer?
The Democrats have moved into a stronger position to take back the House. We had them earlier this summer getting just over that magic number of 218. That's the number of seats you need to take the House. Here we have them inching up to 222, but I need to caution here. There's a margin of error around that, like there is with any poll on this estimate. And that margin of error still has a range where the Republicans could still hold the House. There are scenarios where that happens. What I want to emphasize is within that estimate, all these districts are very close. And we're looking at very small swings among these voters. Just a few more Republican women who are a little bit hesitant to say that they're going to back the Republican candidate. A lot of enthusiasm among Democrats, but some who haven't voted before. And so there's a lot of moving parts still here underneath that edge towards the Dems.
You mentioned women as a voting block. They don't all go in the same direction, but you are starting to see a real shift in how women are voting this election.
Yeah, one of the biggest breaks is if you look at the college, non-college difference. And we started to see this in the last presidential election. And in these districts, it's really important. There's a double-digit edge for Democrats among women with college degrees here. And they also tell us that they're more likely to say their vote is, as you heard in your panel, a vote against the president. And that's different from men who are more inclined to say they're voting in support of the president. And I should emphasize, these battleground districts are battlegrounds because they have relatively more college graduate women in them. So by definition, that's part of what's going on.
And Leslie, I guess the question then is for these college-educated women who maybe in the past have voted Republican, are they comfortable crossing over in this election, or do they stay in a partisan sort of position when they go to the voting booth?
Sure. So the president won about 40% of those college-educated. I always look at the other side, 60% of non-college educated. White women particularly were the ones that voted. So if you look at the pool, if they were white women, they were more inclined to vote for the president. So the dividing line really does come on race. If you're looking at Hispanic women, African-American women, or women who are Republican in marriage, like they're married to, their family votes Republican, that's where you're going to see more of a dividing line. People talk a lot about the suburbs. Maybe there'll be more ticket splitters. We talk about Barbara Comstock's race. Can she hold conservative or Republican-leaning college-educated women? I think they can. I think at the end of the day that more of these folks will fall on the Republican camp than the Democratic one.
And how much of that is a Trump effect?
The most remarkable thing I think that's happening historically, and I know Anthony talks about this, you expect about 30 seats to be lost for the president's party in power. What the president's trying to do is defy history and basically say, can I nationalize my local Trump voters to support a local candidate? If he can do that and get out to all those states he wants to get to those last 30 days, that changes this from a referendum, which it normally is on the president's policies and his character, to a nationalized election saying that we fear open borders, we have a strong economy, you have to be patient and wait for the long-term effect.
And that's been the challenge. Leslie brings up a really good point about who's more motivated to vote in this election. Mm-hmm. And we've been seeing in all of these special elections for the House, Democrats have been outperforming their traditional vote percentage. They have been turning out at a higher percentage. And my colleague looked at the last special election in Ohio, where you have a great combination. This is around the Columbus suburbs and the more rural parts of Ohio. In the Columbus suburbs, where you're going to see a lot of these voters like we saw here in suburban Virginia, they turned out at about 60% of their 2016 average. Okay, so they were turning out at a very high rate for a special election. In the very Trump rural parts of the district, remember, Trump went into this district and campaigned. The vice president went into this district and campaigned. They only turned out at 40%. Yeah. So there is also a limit. And I think there was one voter in there, I can't remember her name, who mentioned about, I'm going to vote for, I'm a Republican, but I'm going to vote for a Republican, but I really don't like Congress, right? And that's really the challenge is Trump's success was based on the fact that he trashed all of Congress, including Republican members of Congress, right? He spent most of 2017 attacking Mitch McConnell, attacking the ineptness of the Republicans in Congress to pass an Obamacare repeal. Now to go back into those voters and say, I know you like me and you like that I shake it up, but I need you to vote for these establishment hacks in Congress that I keep attacking. That's a very difficult thing to do.
We were in Ohio in that district for the special election 2 weeks ago, and it was just fascinating when you speak with women voters especially, how many of them unprompted were saying, I'm here because of the president. I am voting against the president. I want nothing to do with him or anyone who supports him. The polling backs that up. Something like, what is it, a majority say that the candidate must share their views on Donald Trump in order to get their vote. We were seeing that vividly every time we talked to a woman in that district. And, you know, it just makes you wonder if you're hitting that 60% threshold, how this is going to, and you've talked about this, how much this is going to potentially scramble the traditional models that have been used to determine how many people are going to show up. If Democrats show up in far larger numbers, it totally scrambles things.
And Anthony, we were just showing a graphic there that I'd like you to explain a little bit. What are the issues that make people show up, particularly women? I know healthcare is something that polls very high.
It keeps popping up. Every time we give people an issue list, every time we say what is going to be the determinative thing, even if everybody's not talking about it in Washington, it keeps coming up in the polls. For women, then we ask specifically, what is it about healthcare? And it's costs. It's costs, and a lot of folks who say that they don't feel that the changes the Republican Congress has made so far have either affected them or affected them for the better. And I think that's one of the things when we talk about what voters are saying and doing versus what the national politics and campaigns are saying and doing, that does appear to be a little bit of a disconnect.
There's a huge disconnect. We saw this in our own assessment of the ads that have been run through the primaries from the beginning of this year through the end of July. Democrats overwhelmingly talking about health care, much more than they're talking about Donald Trump.
You know, I think that if anything, that's always been a blind spot for the Republican Party. They don't talk about health care. They think about it just, yes, it is in terms of cost, but women will say things like, I'm not going to get to go to the good doctor, now I'm assigned to the bad one. When they're talking about choice and doctors opting out, pre-existing condition, which we know Republicans and Democrats agree on, but there's this kind of myth out there that all of a sudden that pre-existing conditions wouldn't be covered if you went in and tried to change the current system. I think the other interesting part is no matter what policy, and that's kind of my question, no matter what policy you put forward, is not going to change women's verdict on the president's flawed character. That is consistent, and we ask, you know, well, what if he does this and has more tax reform and does infrastructure? It's not going to matter on that.
And yet it isn't necessarily precluding them from voting Republican.
Exactly.
And as we heard from Congresswoman Noem, she seemed reluctant to directly criticize the president.
That might be more just because they're solid red conservative or solid Republicans. And the interesting part, if you contrast that, what are the Democrats giving them? If you look at a Gallup poll this week that talked about there's more of an openness and a more favorability for socialism than there ever has been for capitalism. That's the first time since 2010 that Democrats are starting to see that in a more positive light. What does that mean in contrast to Republicans who are really much more capitalist oriented? They like the strong economy. At least it gives them a place to go.
Ed, I thought it was interesting in our conversation with those voters when I asked women about whether having more female representatives would sort of change Washington.
Yeah.
And they pretty much said, no, everyone's a swamp creature once they get there.
It is, and why I find that interesting is, in fact, if you look at recent congressional history, there is some evidence to suggest that women actually are pushing things along. There was a period a few years ago where you had women either running or the top partisan member of the Budget, Appropriations, Agriculture committees, and all of those big bills were moving at the same time, and they all got through with very little drama. And all of those members said part of the reason this happened is because women were pushing it along, were more willing to meet with their counterparts, were more willing to compromise, and remained laser focused on getting it done. So I would argue the reverse, that in fact, I think we have seen evidence in recent years that if women do get in there and end up in positions where they're moving the legislation along, things actually could get done a lot faster.
And Anthony, I know when you are asking questions, you're always very careful and specific in polling, in how you phrase things. You asked about Trump's handling of issues that affect women.
Right.
And I thought it was interesting in that focus group to hear people define what they thought a woman's issue was.
Yes.
You heard from Jackie, that Trump supporter, that for her, all it meant was the economy. That's a human issue across the board.
Right. Very purposefully, whatever it means to you. Because what we found was that for people who supported the president, and for Republican women, in fact, to your point, they said they were primarily concerned with how he managed the government. But for Democratic women, it became much more personal. It became about whether or not he shared their culture and values, they told us, or even how he handled himself personally. So that can be an issue that affects them as well. So sometimes you want to leave it open because you want to listen to people rather than impose something on them and say, check the box, yes or no. And again, to sort of reemphasize, the differences here are subtle. We're talking about single digits between moderates and Republicans, all of which could and very well might shift as we go on, but it defines the contours of what people are going to argue about.
That hospital food, airplane food line, I think is pretty accurate.
It's pretty clear.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.